So I want to introduce this subject, human energy, which is an emerging concept in psychology. And I want to do it in 4 steps. First, I want to tell you why we're even interested in human energy, what is it, how can we model it, and what are the future steps for human energy. And just for as a first question, how can we even use it, or why should we even have a look at it? You will see this. So we have a look at this one newspaper article. The headline reads, "Okay, if I work 6 hours a day, I am more productive than if I work 8 hours a day." Now, maybe you've seen this, but this is just one example, which is coming from the Daily Mail, which is not really the most reputable newspaper. Here, there was an advertisement for another article about the Spice Girls being afraid of demonic babies. So it's not really something we can trust. But we can see there are other newspapers which have similar headlines. For example, here's something about The Guardian. About Microsoft employees in Japan having a 4-day work week instead of 5 days, and their productivity jumping by around 40%. Okay, but why are companies even exploring this concept? And we can see that one problem which is coming even more nowadays is the burnout syndrome, which is an occupational phenomenon, and which is usually associated with feeling depleted of energy. And it has a rather high lifetime prevalence of around 4.2%, and a 12-month prevalence of around 1.5%, which is quite high. Some people argue that burnout is just another form of depression, but in the end, it's something which affects our mental well-being and our ability to work. Another point of interest is, of course, that stress-related activities, or just in general, that stress is a factor in the absentee. Around 50 to 60% of absence of work can be brought back to stress. And we can see that there's an interest in users and employees in working against this. So self-care apps or stress management apps have an increased interest, as can be seen by the amount of downloads. But also there's an increased revenue for those who actually sell these products, with around $32 billion revenue in the top 10 companies which produce these apps, and that's an increase of around 40% between 2017 and 2018. Okay, this is just one example. But you're probably now dying to know, what is human energy? And if you Google human energy, the first thing you will find is something like this, okay? Something about crystals and chakras and auras. If you have a look at YouTube, you'll find some very interesting videos. For example, this from Deepak Chopra. I'm not sure if you know him. He's very influential in the New Age movement, in alternative medicine. And he has some interesting quotes like this one: "We live as ripples of energy in the vast ocean of energy." That's very inspiring, but it's hard to prove empirically, at least without unlimited funding. So I want to have now a focus on human energy in a more empirical sense and as a psychological concept. And here we can, one thing that we can actually take with us is that human energy is an old and a new concept. It is old because it has been discussed by people like Aristotle, Helmholtz, and Freud have all had some concept of human energy. And even motivation as a concept usually has this word energy, or describes some kind of energization. So that's why it's an old concept. And it's a new concept because now we are finding more and more work, more studies, which are having a look at unifying a whole bunch of motivational theories. And one work which we will be repeatedly having a look at is that of Quinn and colleagues from 2012. And they define human energy as a resource. So this is very important. A resource is anything that allows us to enact a plan. So maybe you know it as time as a resource, or health, or mobility. And the way Quinn and colleagues describe human energy, they also divide it into two sub-elements. The first one is physical energy. Physical energy describes the biological basis. So how much potential energy in the form of glucose or ATP do I have? And then the kinetic energy. How do I turn it into movement, like jogging, for example? And the second part is the energetic activation. This is the subjective part. So if you want to have an example similar to that one, I am, for example, well rested, I have had lots of food, but I don't feel the energy to go jogging or to the fitness studio. So this is a model to describe or to define human energy, but why should this interest us? What can we do with this model? And the answer is understanding what gives and what takes energy can help us with 2 to 3 things. First of all, job crafting. When we help workers decide on what to do next, we can assist them in getting more energy and more effectiveness in doing their job, more productivity. So, for example, should I do the one big boring job at once, or should I split it up by in between doing, like writing a very interesting email? And this can also lead to flow experiences, which is often defined as the experience of investing all of one's conscious attention on one activity. And it's something that we all look forward to. It's that great experience when working and feeling like one with the work. And of course, then we have the problem which we mentioned earlier, burnout. We can identify which activities are a risk for burnout and which activities benefit burnout prevention. And in general, we should note that human energy is a very simplified concept. It's very intuitive. I can use a metaphor like a battery to explain human energy, where other concepts are perhaps have to be analyzed or more thought about more than human energy as a battery. And this in turn leads to reduced workload, which allows us in stressful situations, for example, to actually take the time to notice. And it is a concept which hasn't had a lot of traction in human-computer interaction yet. Having a look at the ACM library, which is the largest library in the area of human-computer interaction, we only have 2 papers on this subject, one of which describing the physical energy in relation to fitness tracking. And the second one is quite interesting approach, which suggests that we can compare human energy with the regulation of human energy with the regulation of other energy resources. Okay, so let's get a bit more in depth into human energy. I want to take a closer look at the paper from Quinn and colleagues, and it's really a 3-step paper. And it has a literature review as a baseline. So having a look at what does the literature say, what is energy or what can be considered energy, and in this step they also contacted authors or researchers in the area of psychology, sociology, physiology. And once they had these papers, they identified 6 key works. What is the most important concepts which relate to energy in some way? And then they integrated these into a model. Now, these key works are all very important theories and many years of research behind them. And when we have a look at these works, we can actually split them into 2 categories. The first category sees energy as a scarce resource. So it is something which there is not a lot of. It is something which we have to somehow protect or retain or find ways to replenish. How can we gain energy which we lose? And the second kind is, of course, that energy is an abundant resource, something which there is a lot of. We have lots of energy in us. We just have to find a way to activate it. So I want to present to you these 3 energy, or well, all 6 of these theories, starting with the 3 scarce resources. And I'm going to do it in 3 steps. I'm going to explain the theory in like 1 sentence or less. And then I'm going to tell you how this theory defines energy or conceptualizes energy and what the energy interaction is. And thirdly, we want to identify what is actually an interesting takeaway which we can use later for an integrated model of human energy. Let's start off with the conservation of resources, which what you see is what you get. It describes how humans have a motivation to retain resources, to keep resources. And those who are good in keeping resources handle stress better, or those who have more resources can handle stress better. And the concept of energy in this theory is vigor, which is another word for like vitality or life force, but is actually a concept of energetic activation. That is, it is a subjective component. And vigor is reduced by demands. Okay, what do I have to do? And it is increased or is supported by resources. So what can I use to do that what I have to do? And in other words, in our takeaway message, energetic activation is a function of job demands and resources which I have available. The second theory is actually quite interesting because it's originally a theory which was proposed by environmental psychologists in how nature is a way to, or how nature energizes us. So when we go out into a forest, how much energy we feel after being there. And since then it has evolved quite a bit, but in the sense of energy, it talks about attention. And attention, as we might remember from other psychological fields, is that attention is necessary for executive functions, for example, inhibiting distractions or information processing. And the more attention I use, to restore attention, there are three ways. The first is being away. So, like the example I had earlier, going out to lunch in the forest as a midday break. Or I have a fascination, so I'm really interested in the email that I'm writing, and I'm fascinated, and I have like this flow experience. And thirdly, compatibility. So I'm doing something which I want to do anyway, or it fits in my lifestyle or in my goal for the day. Now here there are no takeaways because there's a bit of an overlap with the conservation of resources theory. Okay. Another very interesting theory, the ego depletion. And here it's a concept which describes how self-control, which means doing something which, so forcing something to do that which may not be our first inclination. No, getting up to work instead of sleeping for another hour. And this is something which actually requires physical energy. And we know this because in experimental studies, self-control, for example, emotion regulation or thought suppression or coping with stress is actually something that once you have done a bit of it, becomes harder to do the longer you do it. And at the same time, can be restored by either resting or eating something, or in the experimental concept, experimental paradigms which we used with a glucose drink. So this is a physical energy concept. And we know, we can take away, that it is dependent, that self-control is dependent on the remaining resources. And also, another takeaway from the experiments was that those who had more practice or who more often used self-control functions actually got better and required less energy. Let's continue with the next models, which describe abundant resources. The first one is actually a theory which conceptualizes two kinds of activation. The first one is energetic, which we have already met, so to speak, and it accompanies, an energetic activation accompanies positive emotions. Its counterpart, tense activation, is accompanied by negative emotions, and it is usually brought about in a response to a negative interruption, like in an evolutionary sense, a threat, the kind of reaction where we feel threatened and we become where we So for the energetic activation, we would feel like a kind of happy liveliness. In the tense activation, we would feel more like a stiff, prepared to act, fight or flight kind of response. And what's interesting about this is that the energetic activation, the happy liveliness, actually allows us to better access, will give us a brighter breadth of thoughts and actions. Like we become more creative when we have a lot of energetic activation, which therefore leads to more resources which we can use for our demands. On the flip side, being tense reduces our breadth of thoughts and actions. Just think about the last time that you had too much work and too little time. How creative were you in comparison to another situation? Okay, so we take away, we have with greater energetic activation, we have increased resources. And another thing which is which is also pertaining to the example I just gave, is that when you have a higher demand than you have resources, you actually increase the tense activation. Okay, let's come to the our next theory, which is the interaction ritual chain, which describes how we as humans, we like energizing interactions. We like being around people who give us energy, but we also look for situations over and over and over again, so-called rituals. So this could be an example, could be having a morning meeting or going to the bar after work to regain some energy which you lost during the day. In this theory, energy is described as emotional energy, and in the workplace this can be increased, for example, through respectful engagement, so a friendly argument or task enabling, working together in a workshop, or trust, like asking somebody for help. And the takeaway from this theory is that interactions are actively pursued. So we look for intrinsic motivators. And if you speak about intrinsic motivators, you of course have to talk about the self-determination theory, which is a theory on describing this curious, vital, self-motivated kind of motivation. And in the original theory, energy is described as a kind of energetic activation, and which is increased by three factors. First of all, competence, like feeling I can do something, feeling able, relatedness, so feeling connected to others, and autonomy, feeling like an individual. And the takeaway that we can from this model is that intrinsic motivation leads to greater energetic activation, but it also leads us to more demands. When we are motivated, we like to do something which we might not otherwise have done, which requires more demands and therefore takes some of our resources. Okay, so 6 models. How can we integrate them? Quinn and colleagues began with the insights from the conservation of resources theory. Here we have that function, job demands and resources in use, which are then here compared in a comparator. And if we have a good fit of demands and resources, we have energetic activation. I feel empowered when I have the resources to do the job. Secondly, we have the ego depletion, which suggests that we need a differentiation between the different kinds of resources. So when I have the resources which I'm actively using, the resources which are available to me, and the resources which are theoretically possible. And also we have the concept of resource seeking. When I need more resources for the jobs that I have, I go out and I look for them. So the example would be here. I am writing an email. I'm sorry, I'm using the same example, but it's the best one. We have the time that I'm going to take to write the email. I have so many hours left in my workday. And finally, this is the total amount of hours in any day or in hours in a week which I have to actually use. That could be one example here. And of course, this very important concept of practice, getting better the more you use it. For example, using time management techniques or learning time management techniques. And now here we have the first abundant resource theory, which already takes. We have the energetic activation, which is already taken a part of, and responds. We have this interaction that when I have energetic activation, I have a increased breadth of thought. And here we have the tense activation. So when I don't have enough resources for my demands, I have a tense activation which reduces my breadth of thoughts and actions. And then, of course, in the second step, this breadth of thoughts and action leads to me being able to identify or recognizing the resources which are actually available to me. That closes one loop. And finally, we have intrinsic motivation. When I have a large energetic activation, I'm intrinsically motivated. And this leads me to practice more or to be more efficient in getting the resources which I have. But it also leads to me getting more job demands because I want to do more, and therefore I need more resources, and we close the second loop. So, and this is quite interesting. This loop and the second one here can actually be used to describe, for example, burnout. I don't have the resource. I don't feel like I have the resources I need for all the problems which I have to handle. I have a tense activation. I have reduced breadth of thought. I have a feeling that I don't have any resources, and it just gets worse and worse. And here with job crafting, when I optimize the resources which I have, I can then have a more energetic activation, which leads to intrinsic motivation, which then once again leads to more resources and an increased motivation. So this is actually a very interesting model for the next steps. And what are the next steps anyway? Let's get right onto that. So what has to be done and what we in our work group are actually looking at doing is threefold. First of all, we have to substantiate human energy as a factor, get a bit more deeper into the empirical replication and the analysis of the very theoretical work which Quinn and colleagues have already done. Second of all, we want to develop tools for the assessment and for the evaluation of human energy, which should be based on a user-centered design, and which is so streamlined that it doesn't increase workload. We already have the advantage that human energy is a concept which does not require much workload. We shouldn't then put on another complex tool. And finally, we should design intuitive and practical visualizations so that users can make use of human energy or gain insights of human energy for their work or for their health. Okay, so just in summary, human energy is an emerging concept with a unifying theory with implications for motivation and for occupational psychology. Human energy is a resource which can be described as being or having the factors of energetic activation or physical energy. We described an integrated model of human energy proposed by Quinn and colleagues, and incorporates 6 well-founded motivational theories, which are described as either describing energy as a scarce or an abundant resource. And finally, human energy has implications for assisting both job crafting and burnout prevention. And thank you very much.